Well, good afternoon to you. 406 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up this hour, Sean Stevens joins us from the free speech organization FIRE to discuss his organization's finding of the best universities and the worst universities for free speech in our country. Congressman Mark Green is here at 5 o'clock as the immigration crisis continues. He's got some thoughts on that. And then Roger Severino from the Heritage Foundation joins us at 5:30. We'll talk mask mandates with him, as at least one Republican senator looks to ban them forever. No more mask mandates. Meanwhile, Democrats say tyranny's great and we love that uniform. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Yeah, that was JD Vance today, who tried to pass by way of unanimous consent a piece of legislation to block all federal mask mandates. Makes sense to me. Doesn't it make sense to you that, hey, the federal government needs to stay out of putting uniforms on you and on any part of your body, to include your face, and especially your face? This is JD Vance today on the Senate floor saying, I don't want us to go through tyranny like that again.
All of us have lived through the failed experiment of mass mandatory masking. Today, I want to ensure that we do not subject the American people to this tyranny again for the sake of nothing. We've recently seen a seasonal uptick of COVID cases across the country. This is not something to worry about. I don't like this fact, but COVID is here to stay.
Yeah, okay, he's saying a bunch of obvious stuff. He also says that our children need us to have some sanity and not be like a neurotic mess.
We are about to have some serious respiratory problems. We always do in the fall, and maybe it will be worse this fall and this winter than before. But I think that what our children most of all need, and I'm the father of 3 kids under the age of 7, they need us to not be chicken little about every single respiratory pandemic and problem that confronts this country. We are going to have people who get sick from viruses. It has always been thus, and the way to respond to it is with calmness, resolve, and strategic thinking, not by pretending the world is ending, because what has always happened is going to happen once again.
Yes, and not by using pseudoscience as a basis for locking up the faces of American citizens, or even the bodies, like forcing people to stay at home and stay away from each other, and businesses need to close, and the schools need to close. Enough. You're not allowed to do that. No more doing it. That's the position that JD Vance took today, and certainly so many American citizens who value their liberty and don't want to go through what we went through in the past. But Democrats, they're for tyranny. Ed Markey of Massachusetts, the senator, had this to say today as he objected to giving the bill unanimous consent. He didn't want this thing to pass, and here's why.
The bill would undermine the ability of states, cities and towns across this country to make decisions about what's best for their communities.
Yeah, it would get in the way of the government telling you what to do, and we can't allow that.
It would silence and hamstring public health experts who have guided our nation out of the darkest days of a pandemic that
bull into disaster. That's where those people guided us.
Has killed 1,139,000 people in our country in 3 years.
Yeah, and these public health officials did nothing to abate those numbers. In fact, they made it worse, and they made the negative consequences of the pandemic so much worse, with the government shutdowns, the forced masking, the forced jabs, the lies, just the nonsense throughout all of this. If you're wondering why public trust has diminished so much in our health institutions, look no further than all of the lies we were told.
This bill is little more than an attempt by Republicans to dismantle a public health infrastructure
that deserves it.
It had to be built in order to deal with this greatest of pandemics since 1918.
It had to be built to deal with this. Look how well that turned out. Now, Ed Markey, it's useful context here. Mary Margaret Olahan points this out today, our friend, that Ed Markey in 2020, guess what he introduced to the United States Senate? What legislation he introduced? Oh, that's right. Along with Dick Blumenthal, he put out a piece of legislation called the National the name of this thing. This is, Encouraging Masks for All Act. Encouraging Masks for All Act. And as always, with a Democrat piece of legislation, when they say encouraging, they mean something very different in practice. What they meant was mandating. And this is how they sought to do it. I went back to the statement here. This is November of 2020. Ed Markey, his office released a statement that said this. This is, quote, despite guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, millions of Americans are traveling for the Thanksgiving holiday. That's how the statement begins. The statement begins by scolding Americans for daring to travel for Thanksgiving. The CDC told you not to. The government told you not to travel. Who do you think you are, traveling? So despite guidance from the CDC, millions of Americans are now traveling for Thanksgiving, Markey scolds, giving rise to concerns about continued spread of the coronavirus as the country is already suffering a terrible surge of cases and deaths. In other words, Americans are killing people now. You Americans who travel. So Markey and Blumenthal announced a piece of legislation called Encouraging Masks for All Act, which would encourage states to require the use of face masks in all public spaces and outside when one cannot maintain social distance. And outside. So Ed Markey's legislation would have made it so that the state governments forced you all across the country to wear masks when you were outdoors. That was the Ed Markey position. Mr. Tyranny himself. No wonder he's against this legislation. It goes against what he stands for, which is tyranny. At least he's consistent. And how does the federal government achieve this? How do they force the states to impose mask mandates? With money. It's always with money. The legislation provides $5 billion to the Public Health and Social Services Emergency Fund, available to states who implement the masking requirements. States can use this additional funding for efforts to prevent the transmission of COVID. Additionally, the legislation authorizes $75 million for grants to states for promotion of universal mask wearing. So in addition to forcing the mask on you, they give another $75 million to the media companies. Because when you promote something, that means paying the media companies advertising dollars to compel you to put a mask on. That's what that is. A public awareness campaign. The legislation also mandates mask use on federal property. Recent research suggests universal masking could prevent 130,000 deaths from COVID. That research was garbage, by the way. Universal masking could not, would not, and did not prevent 130,000 deaths. Markey says, nonetheless, 15 states do not have mask mandates. Okay, so now they're upset that there are states with liberty. I would imagine those 15 were Republican-run states at the time. States that, and this is, just wild. Just totally wild. Senator Markey in the statement says, masks and face coverings are the essential public health tool. The essential public health tool to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's also a lie. The Cochrane study that just came out towards the beginning of this year was a meta-analysis of every good randomized controlled study on this subject, and it found no benefit to mask wearing. None. None. Of all varieties, none. Markey saying in his confident idiocy that this is the number one way to stop the pandemic in November of 2020. As President-elect Biden recognizes we need to use every technique available to us to encourage mask use, and they go on, and even to mandate mask use nationwide. Mandate it nationwide. Wearing a mask should be considered a moral and health mandate, our primary defense against the coronavirus, said Dick Blumenthal. With cases skyrocketing as we head into the holidays, the Encouraging Masks for All Act would bring us closer to ensuring every American has a face mask and wears it, they say. They want to enforce mask mandates to protect public health. And finally here, just the last thing that stands out to me in this ridiculous statement here in the time machine. According to the CDC, face coverings are the most powerful public health tool we have to slow the transmission of the coronavirus. We have clear scientific evidence They work, and they are our best defense. Another lie. Another clear sign. Oh, really? So fast forward through every other study that showed that that's a lie to the release of the Cochrane study earlier this year, which is a meta-analysis of all of these studies. And what did they conclude? That Ed Markey is a liar. That's what they conclude. That Ed Markey and Richard Blumenthal are liars. That they're full of crap, and that the CDC is full of crap when it says that the most powerful public health tool we have is for Americans to cover their faces. It was a lie. It was based on nothing. And so here you have Ed Markey today blocking a perfectly good piece of legislation designed to preserve liberty. And he wouldn't stand for it. He had to actually object today to granting that legislation passes through the United States Senate. Now, the means by which JD Vance sought to get this through was unanimous consent, and it's on that issue I want to talk a little bit more now. I mentioned I had David Strom on the program yesterday from Hot Air, and we were discussing unanimous consent in the context of Tommy Tuberville, the United States Senator from Alabama. And Tommy Tuberville is right now being demonized by the media broadly for not granting unanimous consent to ram through a ton of nominations for the military. So the way it works in the United States military, the most senior ranks in the military need to be confirmed by the United States Senate. So the administration, the Pentagon, will put forward a list of names that they'd like to have confirmed to get various ranks and billets. And then the Senate has to confirm them. Now, what has routinely happened in the past is a lot of these guys are just confirmed en masse in a block. So we'll just confirm them all. Do I have unanimous consent to confirm these guys? Basically, any objections, no objections, boom, they're through. And you don't actually have to take a vote. You don't have to take a tally. You don't have to assess. They just go through in unanimous consent in the United States Senate. That's not happening right now because Tommy Tuberville said, stop aborting children with American taxpayer dollars. I'm not granting unanimous consent to confirm every single one of these people. If you want to confirm them, do it individually. Put them each up for a vote. But I'm not granting a block grant right now on all of these nominations. And to put a finer point on this issue, Tommy Tuberville went on the cable network News Nation last night with Leland Vittert, and he had this to say about what Democrats are actually doing here.
It's obvious that the Democrats are trying to use it to their advantage, Leland. I'm not holding up nominations. They can bring them to the floor one at a time. I can't hold them up. I can hold up groups at a time. That's what I'm doing. So it's way overblown. I'm not trying to win a Medal of Honor here. I'm trying to keep the military from changing a law that was passed 35 years ago, and now Joe Biden, who voted for it 35 years ago.
The Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment, in order to stop federal funding from going to killing kids.
It's obvious that the Democrats are trying to use it to their advantage, Leland. I'm not holding up nominations. They can keep the military from changing a law that was passed 35 years ago, and now Joe Biden, who voted for it 35 years ago, is trying to change it with a memo. That's not going to happen. It has to go through Congress, and if we just go through Congress and vote on it, I'll accept whatever.
Okay, so is that the story that you've heard from any other outlet? I mean, is anyone telling you this, that Tommy Tuberville is not stopping all the nominations? You know, the Washington Post had a big sob piece this week that the Marine Corps Commandant's not getting confirmed in all of this. Well, then Democrats need to put him forward. Just put him up. Put him up for a vote. Why aren't you putting him up for a vote? Tommy Tuberville saying they can do this. They're refusing to. They don't even want to confirm their own nominees because they think that there's political utility in being pro-human sacrifice. Okay, fine. Do that. Do that. But the reality here is it's in Democrats' court. They can get this through. Either give up the human sacrifice, A, or B, put these guys up for a vote individually. And you can get them through. And if you want to just do the most high priority guys, for instance, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, do that. But stop pretending like it's just Tommy Tuberville, that he's some sort of terrorist. What did somebody call him? Somebody call him like a communist or something. There's like insane allegations being directed at him because he's standing up for life and liberty and the normal order in the United States Senate. That's the kind of slander he's in for. It's 421 now. I mentioned moments ago that I thought somebody had accused Tuberville of being a communist. It's even worse than that. It's the Navy secretary this week on CNN, Carlos Del Toro, accused Tommy Tuberville of, quote, aiding and abetting communists. Here is the audio. This is the insubordinate Secretary of the Navy resenting civilian control of the military.
Stop. You know, Jake, I'm forgiving for someone who's born in a communist country, I would have never imagined that actually one of our own senators would actually be aiding and abetting communist and other autocratic regimes around the world. This is having a real negative impact and will continue to have a real negative impact on our combat readiness. And that's what
What a dirtbag. What a just disgusting human being that person is for going on television and acting like that. And meanwhile, the Politico this week has a report. Pentagon goes on the attack amid Tuberville blockade. This is the United States Pentagon. The military is attacking a sitting United States senator for requiring the Senate to go through regular order in confirming its nominees. They say the Defense Department has dispatched the leaders of 3 branches of the U.S. military to slam the senator for the blockade. First in a Washington Post op-ed on Monday, and then during a CNN interview on Tuesday. That's what you just heard. And then on Wednesday, yesterday, the DOD took the rare step of putting out a news story highlighting the hold's impact on its official media webpage. Also this week, the Pentagon released a slate of new senior nominations, including for the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff. Now, this is a disgrace, a total disgrace. The military going to war against the civilian leaders, the United States senators elected to confirm who leads in that military. Tommy Tuberville saying, yeah, we can do it through regular order, and you can't just change the law to abort more children just without actually asking Congress to get involved. Everything is upside down. The White House on a media campaign right now against the United States Senate, the Pentagon involved in that. Just nuts. Just nuts. Sean Stevens is with us just moments from now from FIRE. We'll talk about free speech on college campuses. Good afternoon. 4:35 now, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us today, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Coming up on the program, Mark Green, the congressman, will be with us at 5 o'clock. He's on the Homeland Security Committee. We'll talk about our wide open borders and the panic it's causing among Democrat mayors right now. Roger Severino is also with us at 5:30 from the Heritage Foundation. We're going to talk about this debate in the Senate over whether or not Americans can be forced to be masked again. And you can join us at 888-630-9625. All right, let's bring in Sean Stevens. He's with the excellent civil liberties organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's the director of polling and analytics there. Sean, great to have you with us today.
Hi, yeah, thanks to be here.
I was really intrigued by the fact that you have just released a list of the best universities and the worst universities for free speech, and this is something you do on an annual basis?
Yeah, this is the 4th year in a row we've done this. We started doing this in 2020.
And how do you measure, before we get to the actual results, how do you measure whether or not an institution is good when it comes to free speech versus terrible?
Yeah, so we have there's 2 major categories of components, and then within them there's some subcomponents. So very briefly, there's a survey where we ask the students at these individual schools basically like kind of what's their experience like with expressing themselves on campus in different settings, how tolerant they are of different kinds of controversial speakers, what do they think about the administration, would they defend free speech, do they make their stance on that clear, that they would defend the speaker during a controversy, questions like that. And we use that to make up survey components that we call kind of like the student perception components. Mm-hmm. And then we factor in other research that FIRE does, where we have a policy reform team that rates the student speech code policies that a school has on the books. So anything kind of in a student handbook that could potentially be used to regulate speech,
right.
They're evaluated for whether they are, they pass constitutional muster or not, or if they're arbitrarily worded, or if they clearly infringe on speech. So we kind of have a tiered system there.
Right. So on that front, if I can, I know that for years, I know that for years, Fire has been fighting against, say, these things called free speech zones on campus. Sometimes college campuses will say, well, you're only allowed to engage in free speech inside this tiny circle on the quad. You can stand there and engage in free speech, but beyond that, you're not allowed. And Fire is very much against that.
Yeah, that would be an example of a speech code that we would give like a yellow or red light rating, depending on how it's worded.
Right.
So that's like part of our tiered system, and then we have other databases that we maintain where we track, the presence and then the outcomes of speech controversies on campus. So we have something called the Campus Disinvitation Database. So this looks at campaigns to disinvite speakers from campus and then the outcomes that occur there. So schools get a bonus if they defend the speaker's rights, and there's a penalty if a disinvitation occurs or an event is disrupted while it's going on.
So if the campus is not hospitable to the speaker, so they allow the speaker on campus, but it gets shouted down, the speech has to get canceled, that would work against the school.
Yeah, that works against the school, and if they defend the speaker, in the face of a controversy, they would get a bonus. And then we have two others, one that we're still working on building, and it's not like fully public yet, but the other one is. We have what we call Scholars Under Fire database. And this is effectively, it's similar to the campus disinvitation one, but it's basically attempts to get professors or other kinds of researchers on campus sanctioned for either their research, their expression in that way, like their academic expression, or it could be just their general free expression, like they've given their views on social media or something like that.
Got it.
And they get targeted. And we're building an equivalent database like that for students and like student groups, student organizations. So those were incorporated this year for the first. That last grouping, the student groups and organizations, that was incorporated this year for the first time.
Got it. Great. So one of the things that you make me think of is you talk about speech controversies in particular is that sometimes universities impose fees on organizations with disfavored political views, claiming that they need to cover the costs of extra security. They'll put a fee down. They'll be like, hey, we've got it. Sorry, your speaker's too controversial. We're going to need a bunch of extra cops. It's going to cost you thousands of dollars to bring security into this event. Would that work against the institution in terms of their free speech score?
Yeah, there's examples where it does. If it's clear that it's been arbitrarily applied, and there's even some cases where student organizations have sued schools and won the lawsuits that they had imposed unconstitutional security fees on them. So yes, those would work against universities if they're in our disinvitation database.
Okay. All right. Let's go through the rankings here. Let's begin, I would say, with the worst. Who are the worst institutions in the country when it comes to free speech?
So I'll give you two groups on that, because there's this year, and then there's what we can say about across the 4 years. So this year, the bottom five are Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of South Carolina, Georgetown, and Fordham.
Wow.
And then a handful of schools from the other bucket, which includes a good chunk of the ones I just named. Schools that have performed consistently, near the bottom of the rankings in at least 3 of the 4 years that we've surveyed. We've done the survey. So every year we've actually added schools to the rankings. So I'm now only focusing on schools we've had in there at least three times.
Right.
And so the schools I'd say are, consistently performed badly are Harvard and Georgetown, as mentioned, and Fordham. And then you have Marquette, Rensselaer, Polytechnic Institute. University of Pennsylvania was the second to worst last year, too. So I think they're kind of trending in that direction. There's some others, but we can go on to the, good performing schools now. That's a smattering of some of the, fairly bad ones.
Well, here's what worries me in no small part about this. Some of the schools you named also include some of the top law schools in the country. Are those considered in this assessment, or is this just undergrad?
So our survey is only of undergraduates.
Got it.
The disinvitation database and the incident databases, those can include things that occurred at like a graduate school event or school of law, which is essentially like generally they're often on the same campus.
Yeah.
And so, the high profileness of an event like that, we imagine there's undergraduates who aren't oblivious to it.
Right.
So those incidents are included, but we only survey undergraduates, and the speech code evaluation is of like the student handbook, which, probably applies more strictly to undergraduates because graduate students tend to often kind of straddle their faculty sometimes and employees sometimes, and sometimes their students, and it's like a little weirder.
Sure. But it is worrisome, though, that places like the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard and Georgetown, these are institutions that churn out some of the top lawyers in the entire country, and they are places where free speech is suffocated. What kind of members of society are these institutions churning out?
Yeah, and I think that's a reason that I think more broadly, one should be concerned whether or not they plan to or know anyone who attends these schools or has attended these schools. As you've pointed out, these are some of the most influential institutions in the country, and so presumably a lot of the graduates from these institutions are going to, find their way into prestigious, influential positions in various industries.
Right.
So I think these attitudes matter.
Yes, for sure. Okay, and then you do have the best. There are some schools that are performing well in this survey. Who are they?
Yeah, so I'll do the same thing. I'll give you the top 5 this year, and then the bucket of schools that we can say over the 4 years we've been doing this, we're fairly confident are good schools at this. And so the 5 best this year are Michigan Tech, Auburn, University of New Hampshire, Oregon State, and Florida State. And then I'd say consistently across the past 4 years, the schools that have performed well and essentially always been in the top 25 are, some of it includes some of the schools I just said. It includes University of New Hampshire, it includes Auburn, it includes Oregon State, it includes Florida State. This is the first year we surveyed Michigan Tech, so we can't say much about them. To that group, I'd add University of Chicago, Kansas State, Mississippi State, George Mason, Purdue, University of Virginia, NC State, and Colorado Boulder.
Wow, okay, there's some good news. A couple local schools in there for us, too.
Yeah.
So as you say that, these are the type of schools the FIRE assesses that are more accommodating to diverse viewpoints and would allow conflicting opinions to exist on campus and for a more robust debate.
Yeah, the survey results vary at the different schools on the different, I've mentioned there's a number of subcomponents from the survey things. So, some of the schools that do well, there's still some components where there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. They don't necessarily do well on that one component.
Sure.
But typically they're doing average, they're not doing poorly on, too many of these. They have what we would call all of them have green light speech code policies, which means there's nothing that overtly threatens speech in their student handbook regulations. It doesn't necessarily mean everything's perfect and they're not going to crack down on things.
Yes.
For instance, University of Chicago was number 1, number 2, number 1 the first 3 years, and this year's number 13. The sole reason they're not number 2, which they would be, is they denied recognition to a student organization this year. And we felt that it was on, it was basically a viewpoint discriminatory basis, and the policy was applied arbitrarily. Got it.
Yeah. So what's the trend when it comes to speech and these campuses? Obviously, we've seen a lot of change over, especially it seems like the last 5 years. My impression from the outside of academia is that schools are becoming more censorial and less open to diverse viewpoints. What is the trend?
Yeah. So in our survey data, I'd say most of the survey data in terms of trend lines over the 4 years, we've generally, not every question has been asked every single 4 years, but there's a core set of questions that have been asked at least every year for 3 of the 4 years, and there's like a handful of questions that were asked every year. So comfortable talking about trends on these. I'd say like on a lot of those, the trends are stagnant, and by stagnant, I wouldn't mean good because you wouldn't necessarily think the numbers are great. But they haven't really moved around much. But then there are a few data points that came this year that we'll see what happens next year, but they could be a cause for concern if the trend continues. We ask questions about the acceptability of different types of protests and effectively like liberal forms of protest to stop a campus speech. And so we ask if how acceptable is it to block entry into an event, for students to block entry into an event on campus, and how acceptable is it for students to use violence to stop a campus speech. And they have, 4 response options ranging from always acceptable to never. And so if we toss out never and we just focus on the people who have, if we focus on never and toss out the other 3. Last year, 63% of students said blocking entry was never acceptable. It's now 55. For violence, last year, 80% said it was never acceptable. It's now 73.
Wow. And this is among undergraduate college students?
Yes, this is undergraduates. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are, trend, I wouldn't necessarily call that a trend.
Well, yeah, with 2 data points, but that certainly it's headed in the wrong direction.
But it's something where if that kind of stays at the level it's at this year, next year, or drops even further, then it might be cause for bigger concern.
Are there, I know you're a nonpartisan organization, but do you detect partisan patterns in any of this?
So I think the honest question to that is the majority of campuses, the students predominantly identify as liberal.
Yes.
That's going to be the case for faculty too. We know that, but there are a handful of campuses where that's not the case, and it flips around. And we do have a couple campuses where it's very conservative in a sense. And so I think the most honest thing to say is what's common on across the campuses is hostility towards the minority viewpoint, like whichever that is. And granted, it's going to more often be on the minority viewpoint is going to be a right of center conservative viewpoint. But when that's not the case, you see it totally flip around, and it's the liberal viewpoint that kind of receives.
Sure. I get that it's more likely to be rejected, but that makes sense. But the means by which that viewpoint's rejected, I think, matters. So do you see any evidence of conservative campuses using violence or shutting down events to prevent those?
Those are actually rare events on kind of the campuses that skew more conservative. And then kind of in the broader question to what you asked, more broadly a little while ago.
Right.
I'd say in trend, so back to the trend part, it's like in the survey data, a little bit, not so much, stagnant at best, maybe some things getting worse. In our databases where we observe the incidents and record these different incidents and controversies, that's where we're seeing upticks recently.
Got it. All right. Well, I'm glad you're out there tracking it. You've been doing it for a long time. You have a great organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Sean Stevens does polling and analytics there. Sean, thank you very much for giving us this assessment today. You have got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me with this. The LA Times reporting this afternoon, headline, Biden administration considers forcing migrant families to remain in Texas. The Biden administration, so they can enforce a border. It turns out it is possible to corral people and keep them in an American state. You would keep them in Texas so that you don't get more audio of Eric Adams ripping the Biden administration for the overwhelming crush of illegals coming into New York. This is Eric Adams last night.
Let me tell you something, New Yorkers. Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City.
Okay, that's Eric Adams saying that illegal immigration is going to destroy New York City. And by the way, Congressman Mark Green is going to join us coming up in just a few minutes. We'll have to ask him about this. The LA Times says the Biden administration is considering forcing some migrant families who enter the country without authorization, that would be illegally, to remain near the border in Texas while awaiting asylum screening, effectively limiting their ability to travel within the United States. 3 U.S. officials now telling the LA Times. Administration officials have been considering the idea as a way to stem recent increases in the numbers of migrant families crossing the southern border, which reportedly reached an all-time high last month. Supporters of the Remain in Texas idea, what a scam. What a scam. We had a Remain in Mexico policy. Now they're calling it Remain in Texas. They have moved the border. The Biden administration is in the process of changing the borders of the United States so that Texas is stuck on the other side. Supporters of the Remain in Texas idea, which has yet to be finalized, hope that it would help the administration advance its goals of quickly deporting families who fail initial asylum screening. Its goals. Give me a break. They're not trying to deport people quickly. That's idiotic. Who fail initial asylum screenings and deterring other families from crossing in the first place. But the proposal, which recalls President Reagan's efforts, come on, to limit asylum seekers' movements in the late 1980s, is likely to draw fierce opposition from immigrants' rights groups, that would be illegal immigrants' rights groups, and border state officials. Since 2022, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, has bused thousands of migrants, that's illegal immigrants. Everybody lies. It's all euphemisms. It's all just complete, it's lies top to bottom, including from the LA Times here. Thousands of migrants out of his state to Democrat-run cities, such as Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, D.C. The Biden plan would force certain migrant families to remain in Texas. Let me add one other caveat here. These are not families, all of them. There's plenty of people who are using children as get into the country free cards as a part of an extensive human trafficking effort and calling themselves family units, taking advantage of our system and Biden's stupidity. They say that it would force certain migrant, quote, families to remain in Texas or possibly other border states by tracking their location through GPS monitoring devices. Oh, so again, border enforcement is possible when you want to force illegal immigrants to stay in a state like Texas. What else is happening in Texas? Well, in Texas, there are more Republican voters than ever before. The Democrat dream of turning Texas blue by using race to do it. Remember, demographics are destiny? This was their big plan. It's been blowing up in their face. It's not been working. Texas is much more Republican than it was a decade ago. And now they're filling the state with illegals to do what? Eventually put them on the, quote, pathway to citizenship and the pathway to permanent Democrat power? Everything's a scam. They can enforce our borders north of the states on the border. We're going to talk to Congressman Mark Green just moments from now. He has a lot to say on this, I'm sure.